Barbara Eden sat alone in the dim light of her Los Angeles living room, the soft hum of the city outside barely reaching her ears. Her eyes, usually sparkling with the mischievous glint of Jeannie, were heavy with a sadness few had ever seen. The news story had hit like a lightning bolt, sweeping across every network, every online headline, shaking the foundations of Hollywood and her own memories. She hadn't expected it. No one did. And yet, as she clasped her hands tightly in her lap, the weight of it pressed down on her chest like a relentless tide. Friends whispered that she looked decades older overnight, and in that fragile silence, secrets she had kept hidden for years began clawing their way to the surface. Barbara's mind drifted back to the early days, the laughter-filled sets of I Dream of Jeannie, the camaraderie she shared with Larry Hagman and Bill Daly, the long nights when cameras stopped rolling but the struggles continued. Hollywood was glamorous on the outside, but behind closed doors she had seen pain, betrayal, and heartbreak in ways the public could never imagine. And now, the scandal that had erupted, one that implicated some of the biggest names she had known, admired, and, in some cases, loved, was forcing her to confront shadows she had long buried. She remembered the phone call that morning, the one that made her knees buckle and her hands tremble. A voice she had trusted, someone she had considered family, had simply said, "Barbara, it's everywhere. You need to know." She had tried to steady her breath, to focus on the words, but they tumbled through her mind in fragments, each one cutting deeper than the last. The story involved names that echoed through Hollywood history, people she had dined with, laughed with, even cried with. And now the veneer of friendship and trust seemed unbearably thin, revealing a darkness she had feared was only. I whispered in the tabloids. Her thoughts turned to the people she loved most, her family, who had always been her anchor through years of heartbreak and illness. She thought of her son, the man who had grown up watching her embody magic and joy on screen, while she secretly carried burdens too heavy to share. How would she explain this? How could she protect him from the crushing weight of a world that often seemed indifferent to truth, justice, or innocence? She felt a wave of guilt, a deep, lingering regret for not speaking sooner, for not seeing the warning signs, for allowing the glamour of fame to blind her to the fragile human reality underneath. Barbara's voice, usually warm and melodic, faltered as she recounted moments that had once been private. Late-night conversations with her closest friends, tears shed over lost opportunities, and whispered confessions from other stars whose lives had been quietly destroyed by the same forces that were now exposed. She spoke of Marilyn, of Elizabeth, of people whose brilliance had been eclipsed by scandal, whose laughter had been silenced long before the cameras caught it. And through it all, Barbara's own fragility was revealed, the exhaustion etched into her face, the tremor in her hands, the quiet sobs she had tried to mask behind the practiced charm of a smile. For hours she replayed memories in her mind, each one a mix of joy and sorrow, humor and regret. Every photograph on the walls seemed to stare back at her, faces frozen in time, oblivious to the chaos unfolding in the present. She remembered the advice of a legendary director, words that had stayed with her even as decades passed. "Barbara, the world will love the magic you create, but it rarely forgives the truths you carry." Tonight those truths had come rushing to the surface, and as she sat in silence, the dim light casting shadows across her worn Fias. Tours, she realized the long, painful journey of reckoning was only just beginning. The room was quiet, but the storm inside her heart raged, a relentless reminder of how quickly the world could change, how easily trust could shatter, and how deeply secrets once hidden could wound. And somewhere, deep in the recesses of her memory, a name whispered itself, haunting her. The one who had betrayed everything she believed in, the one who had made the world watch as innocence was compromised, the one whose choices would forever ripple through her life. The next morning Barbara awoke before dawn, the kind of early hours she used to treasure for quiet reflection, now haunted by a restless unease. Her bed felt too large, too empty, as though the world outside had grown heavier while she slept. The news was relentless. Every channel replayed the story, dissected it, and speculated on it. She turned on the television, her hands clutching the edge of the nightstand, and saw faces she recognized. Colleagues, friends, co-stars paraded across the screen, their voices clipped, statements rehearsed. Yet the story was never just the names. It was the web of betrayal, the invisible threads that connected them all, and the undeniable fact that Barbara herself had brushed against it, unknowingly all these years. She thought about the private moments Hollywood would never see, the closed-door meetings, the whispered apologies, the subtle warnings passed like fragile notes in a storm. There were times when she had glimpsed the darkness, moments when intuition told her something was wrong, but she had been told to smile, to perform, to maintain the illusion. And she had. She had smiled through fear, through heartbreak, through the silent deaths of reputations and friendships that would never recover. The guilt she carried now was suffocating, a deep, gnawing ache that no amount of acting could conceal. Her mind wandered to Larry Hagman, whose boisterous laughter could fill a room, and whose presence had once been a shield against the isolating loneliness of fame. Larry had warned her once, during a quiet break between takes, "Barbara, in this town, you see the best and the worst, often at the same time. Remember who you are." She had laughed, brushed it off, never imagining that years later those words would echo with a chilling relevance. And now, in the shadow of scandal, she understood what he had meant. The worst had come to light, and it had left a stain on memories that were supposed to be sacred, untouchable. Barbara's thoughts drifted to the hospital visits she had made in secret, the times she had sat by the bedsides of friends who were quietly suffering, their illnesses hidden behind the glimmer of stardom. She remembered the loneliness, the quiet despair, the tears that came in private, away from the cameras and the applause. Those memories now felt intertwined with the scandal, another layer of heartbreak that few would ever comprehend. She wondered if any of those friends had known the full truth, or if they too had been victims of the same merciless Hollywood machinery. The weight of all this seemed almost unbearable. Her voice trembled as she spoke to the camera crew she had reluctantly allowed into her home, a team who had promised discretion, yet whose presence reminded her how public her pain had already become. She recounted the moments of betrayal she had witnessed, the painful decisions she had been forced to make, and the whispered confessions that had left her sleepless for decades. Each revelation was like a blade, cutting through the carefully maintained facade of a life that had always seemed magical to the outside world. And then there were the regrets, the choices she wished she could undo. Invitations she had declined, conversations she had avoided, moments she had overlooked that might have prevented lives from being upended. Barbara's hand shook as she pressed it against her heart, feeling the persistent rhythm of sorrow. "I was lucky," she whispered, voice barely audible, "but I also survived by looking away. And maybe I should have done more." The vulnerability in her words hung in the air, raw and unpolished, a stark contrast to the polished image millions had adored for decades. As the morning light grew stronger, Barbara realized that the world she had known, the bright lights, the laughter, the magic, was forever altered. The scandal had changed everything, and yet there was a part of her that clung to hope, to the possibility of redemption, truth, and perhaps even forgiveness. But that hope was fragile, and the journey through the maze of secrets, lies, and betrayal had only just begun. Somewhere in the depths of her heart, she knew the path ahead would be long, painful, and filled with moments she was not yet ready to face. Barbara spent the next days in a strange limbo between the public storm and the private unraveling of her own heart. Calls came from old friends, some tentative, others desperate, seeking reassurance, clarification, or even absolution. She answered few, letting the unanswered ones pile up like silent reminders of a life now suspended in uncertainty. Every ring of the phone made her flinch. Every message notification brought a shiver of dread. She had always been known as the cheerful, resilient Jeannie, the woman who could make a lamp wink or a genie bottle dance. But that Barbara, the icon, was only a mask. Behind it, there was a woman who had felt loss too keenly, who had endured betrayal too painfully. And now the scandal had ripped open wounds. She thought, were long healed. Her thoughts returned to her family, the son she adored, the siblings who had shared her childhood laughter and sorrow. She worried constantly about their exposure to the media frenzy, as the way headlines and hashtags could distort reality into something crueler than it was. She remembered her mother's gentle words, spoken in a voice both tender and firm. "Barbara, you can survive anything, but you must always protect those you love first." Those words had been her compass for decades, guiding her through heartbreak, failed relationships, and moments of crushing loneliness. Yet now they felt like a fragile lifeline, stretched thin by forces far larger than any one person could control. Barbara's memory drifted to encounters with other Hollywood giants, those whose brilliance often concealed their own torment. She recalled Gregory Peck, whose calm authority masked private grief, and Elizabeth Taylor, whose fierce love and fearlessness had been tempered by losses no camera ever captured. She remembered late-night dinners where the conversation danced between laughter and confessions, moments of fleeting intimacy where stars let down their shields, revealing vulnerabilities rarely glimpsed by the public. And now those memories felt tainted, intertwined with the scandal, like beautiful melodies played in a minor key. At night, she often sat by the window, staring into the city below, recalling the faces of those affected. There were moments when she would cry silently, letting tears streak her face as she whispered apologies to people who would never hear them. Her regrets piled like bricks in her chest. Decisions she hadn't made, interventions she hadn't taken, truths she had kept silent out of fear, politeness, or loyalty. And in those quiet moments, she confronted a truth she had always tried to avoid. Sometimes survival in Hollywood meant watching the world break without intervening, and that survival came with a cost. The story had also forced her to confront her own illness, something she had kept private for years. There were days when exhaustion dragged her down, when the tremor in her hands became more pronounced, when fatigue blurred the line between physical weakness and emotional despair. It was during these days that Barbara truly understood the weight of legacy, the duality of being revered yet vulnerable, celebrated yet powerless in the face of forces beyond her control. The scandal had not just touched her. It had unearthed every hidden fragility she had carried for decades. Then there were the breakdowns, the moments when she could no longer contain herself. Cameras caught her once, outside a studio, weeping as she tried to compose herself, and though the world speculated about what had triggered her grief, few understood the depth of her anguish. This was more than personal. It was a reckoning with a Hollywood she had loved, a world she had devoted herself to, and yet a world that had betrayed its own. Every laugh line, every sparkling eye, every moment of joy she had offered the public now felt like a thin veneer over a life riddled with pain, loss, and secrets that were finally surfacing in the harsh light of exposure. Barbara's voice, when she finally spoke, trembled like the fragile wings of a bird. She told of private conversations with stars who were now accused, of whispered confessions and cryptic warnings, of friends lost to illness, addiction, or despair, all hidden behind Hollywood's glittering facade. And in the midst of her recollections, she admitted something raw and devastating, that the very system she had once believed in, the industry she had loved and dedicated her life to, had left scars that could never fully heal. She wept not just for herself, but for all those whose voices had been silenced, whose lives had been quietly shattered, while the world cheered from a distance. Barbara found herself retreating further into solitude, The world outside moving too fast, too loud, too brutal. The phones had stopped ringing as frequently. The reporters had shifted to fresher scandals, yet the weight of what she carried remained unrelenting. She wandered the hallways of her home like a ghost among her own memories, touching the edges of photographs, the worn corners of scripts, and costumes that smelled faintly of decades past. Each object seemed to whisper fragments of forgotten conversations, laughter, and heartbreak. Echoes that now felt impossibly heavy against the backdrop of betrayal the scandal had exposed. She thought of the people who had tried to guide her, those whose wisdom had been earned through decades of survival in a merciless industry. One night, she remembered sitting across from Jane Fonda at a small Hollywood party, Jane's voice calm and deliberate. "Barbara, you'll see the cracks in this world eventually. It's not the fame that hurts, it's the truth hiding behind it." At the time, Barbara had nodded politely, masking the unease the words stirred in her. Now those words rang like a solemn prophecy. The cracks weren't just in the industry. They were in her life, her memories, her sense of trust, her understanding of herself. The scandal had unearthed old regrets, relationships that had quietly dissolved, and friendships that had eroded under the weight of secrets. She remembered a late-night phone call with a co-star who had admitted, almost in passing, that some of their colleagues had been compromised, manipulated, or silenced for years. Barbara had felt a chill, a mix of fear and disbelief, but had kept her composure. She had told herself, "It's not my battle. I survive, I perform, I smile." But now those words felt like a betrayal to herself. By staying silent, by performing, she had been complicit in the shadows that now rose to the surface. Her mind returned to personal tragedy, the losses she had suffered quietly, the moments of grief that had never reached the tabloids. Friends lost to illness, lovers lost to time, colleagues whose deaths had left a void behind the studio lights. She recalled sitting in hospitals, holding hands, whispering comforts that felt fragile against the vast machinery of life and death. Those moments of vulnerability now seemed connected, in some inexplicable way, to the scandal. A reminder that no life in Hollywood was truly insulated from the consequences of others' choices. Barbara's breakdowns became more frequent. Alone in her kitchen, she would weep into her hands, the lines of her face softened by tears. She remembered the last words of some of her dearest friends, voices etched permanently in her memory, urging her to be brave, to speak, to act. But she had held back. Now the enormity of those missed chances pressed down, a relentless ache she could neither evade nor erase. She whispered apologies to empty rooms, to ghosts of friends, and to the audience who had never seen this raw, unpolished side of her. And yet, in the midst of this despair, Barbara began to confront hidden truths she had long denied. She acknowledged the subtle betrayals, the quiet manipulations, the times when she had looked away to protect herself or preserve her career. Each confession was a dagger, each memory a mirror reflecting the life she had led and the compromises she had made. But there was also clarity, a painful, illuminating clarity that told her survival was not just about smiling on camera, but about facing the darkness she had once ignored. The truth, she realized, was both a burden and a liberation, a bridge to reckon with the past while trying to find a sliver of peace in the present.